Hours after the Supreme Court restrained the Central Bank of Nigeria and the government from sticking to the February 10th deadline for people to swap their old Naira notes for the new ones, the federal government has approached the Apex Court asking it to dismiss the original suit challenging that deadline set by the CBN. In a preliminary objection filed on Wednesday through his lawyers, the Attorney General of the Federation, Abubakar Malami, argued that the Supreme Court lacks the jurisdiction to entertain the matter. President Muhammadu Buhari had met with the CBN Governor Godwin Ufeli and Attorney General of the Federation at the Presidential Villa, Abuja, shortly after the Supreme Court ruling, but the outcome of the meeting is yet to be known. Despite the Supreme Court's interim injunction restraining the CBN from enforcing the deadline for phasing out the old notes, more commercial banks have shut their doors to customers, halting cash operations while putting out notices informing customers that the deadline still stands. The CBN too has not given any indication yet that it is going to comply with the ruling of the Supreme Court. There are unconfirmed reports that the Apex Bank may choose to ignore the Apex Court's ruling on the argument it was not a party to the case before the courts. Well, joining me on the news right now to speak more on this is legal expert Evans Ufeli. Thank you very much for joining me on the news. Now, there have been arguments in some quarters that the Supreme Court acted outside its jurisdiction in its ruling, which has prompted the suit filed by the Attorney General. Do you agree with that? And what do you make of the argument by some that the CBN is not party to the case before the Apex Court and that the ruling could not apply to it?
Well, the Supreme Court did not act outside its jurisdiction because once a matter is brought before a court, okay, whether or not the court have jurisdiction, the court must first of all assume jurisdiction to determine whether it has jurisdiction or not. That is the law. In this case, the federal government have filed a preliminary objection to the effect that the Supreme Court have no jurisdiction, given the fact that it's actually there's a dispute with the CBN and the Nigerian citizen in terms of how it has managed its policy of the redesign of the Naira notes. But the truth is that when a preliminary objection has been filed, that preliminary objection must be heard. Okay? And how will the court hear the preliminary objection? The court must first assume jurisdiction to now hear the preliminary objection, the details and the merit of the preliminary objection to determine whether it has jurisdiction or not. So the order the court made already is an ex parte application, that was filed together with the substantive application by the three states. And then because of the urgency of the case, the Supreme Court has to, first of all, make that interlocutory order asking parties to maintain the status quo, that they should, the federal government should not go ahead with its plan to make the Naira, the old note, no longer a legal tender from 10th of this month. So there is no issue of the Supreme Court acting outside the jurisdiction. What would have raised an issue is whether or not the case was brought before the appropriate court. But all that will be determined between now and the next adjournment, which is on the 15th.
Now, let me ask, so far the CBN has not given any indication it plans to comply with the ruling of the Apex Court. Now, if that happens, what can the Supreme Court do?
Well, there's an order by the Supreme Court. So the CBN will have no right to flout the order of the Supreme Court because it will come with consequences. There's an order against the federal government not to go ahead to enforce, okay? So whether that order is right in law or wrong, you must first obey it before you determine its, whether it is appropriate or inappropriate. So the orders of the court are not obeyed because they are right or wrong. They are obeyed because it is emanating from the judicial system, and the orders of the court are sacred. Much so than an order from the Supreme Court, it must be obeyed. All institutions and persons must obey the order of the Supreme Court or any court in the land. It is after the matter is fully determined and maybe there is another order vacating the subsisting one. That is when you can now take a contrary view according to the new order in question. But for now, the order of the court is valid and subsistent.
Briefly before I let you go, we are just weeks to the presidential elections and we are faced with all of this confusion and chaos, you know, caused by the redesigned currency. Do you see all of these impacting the elections?
Well, I didn't get the question right.
Oh, I asked, I said we are just a few weeks to the presidential elections and all of this is happening, all of this chaos. So I'm asking if you see all of these somehow impacting the general elections.
Of course, it's impacting the preparation of the general election because the policy of the federal government came at a very wrong time. The policy of the CBN came at a time when the nation needed stability. You see, in the build-up to election, the country anywhere in the world requires stability. There should be no issues of instability and all that. So I think we didn't get this right. We forgot that we are at a point of transition politically. Some people have made insinuations and conjectures that the redesign is targeted at some politicians or whatever. I don't think if that was true, I don't think it was wise because we need to have stability before we can have transition. The Nigerian state is already going through a lot, from insecurity issues to lack of wealth, to recession, to economic downturn, to so many issues that are weighty enough to destabilize the country. And now to come with a Naira redesign where people can no longer get cash as much as they want, and you also have a deadline for which the old Naira note will cease to be a legal tender, and you have election just maybe just 15 days away from the day the old note will cease to be a legal tender, and there is no adequate supply of the new Naira notes. What you have is total chaos, which was avoidable. I don't think there's any need to introduce this redesign of the Naira at this time of the year, when we are building up to election. And we create this kind of problems for ourselves. Now everywhere is overheated. People are protesting all over the place. And we need this stability. We've said it time without now that the federal government, with its policy, the federal government must understand the psychology of the Nigerian state. That people are just living at the verge of survival. That anything that will spike controversy or spike issues may lead to issues that they would take the country on a setback. And that is why the federal government must resolve this issue, because this election must hold. Otherwise, we'll run into a constitutional crisis. We need to talk about interim government and the rest of it. And that will lead to a lot of issues. And we don't want this democracy to be disrupted by any...
All right, now, I'm afraid that's how much we can take on the news. Ufeli, legal expert, thank you for your time and contribution.